Hi guys, today we're going to be revising the impact and influence of corporations in sport. We're focusing this in the paper 2 for Edexcel A-level PE, that is GCE PE, and looking at particularly the social aspects part of paper 2. So when we're breaking this question down, there are three ways the question may be approached. The first could be looking at influence, what influence a corporation has. They could look at what are the advantages of a corporation and what the disadvantages of a corporation are. This could also be put together as a 15 marker. Now, it hasn't been a 15 marker yet, but it is something you want to think about. And if you revise it as a 15 marker, then you're setting yourselves up to break it down into those three areas. So if it was a 15 marker, and it could look at general questions, and the area we're looking at is the difference between competing for a corporation over a geographical based team. So rather than say playing for your local London team or Birmingham team, you're actually representing a particular corporation. So we'll dive in a little bit deeper in a minute to what the corporations are. But if this was a question, it was 15 marker, and it could say analyze or assess or discuss the influence of competing for a corporation over geographically based teams, 15 marks. Then you spend the first 5 marks just talking about what corporations are, what their general influence is. You could then break it into 5 marks of advantages, 5 marks into disadvantages, and then conclude with your overall answer to the question. So let's look at the influence of corporations. So this would be your first part, your introduction if it was a 15-mark exam question, but in general, this area, the actual influence of corporations, hasn't really been asked a lot, and there has been questions on the specimen paper, but that's about it. So it possibly due to come up soon, and this is recorded in 2025, so if you're watching this a bit later, it may have already come up, but it hasn't come up as of yet. So a corporation is essentially a business that runs a sports team, and is often more seen in Formula One. The best example you could take is Formula One teams or cycling teams. So in the sports scenario, you've got teams like Ferrari and Red Bull, and in cycling, you've got teams like Team Sky, and they are where a organisation, a business, will put a team together to compete in a specific sport. So let's start with some basics now. Corporations could be named after the name of a corporation. So like Ferrari in Formula One is an organization, and they've named themselves after the corporation that is their main backer, which is Ferrari in that sense. So they're literally named Ferrari. Whereas some teams in Formula One particularly are owned by a corporation, so that the corporation has expanded, and Red Bull is the main sort of driving force of corporations, where they own teams, and they enter the competitions as their team. So you've got Red Bull in Formula One. And Red Bull are actually doing that in football and ice hockey and lots of other sports. So Red Bull are a corporation who own teams, and are therefore influencing the sport that way. So you've got what the corporations are, where they're seen, and then some examples where they're either named after them, or they are actual owners of the team. Now, a performer can compete for both their country and a corporation. So, for example, in the Olympics, let's take cycling, where an athlete could be representing the named cycling team. Let's take Team Sky in cycling, but they could then also represent GB or whoever they're from, whichever country they're from, in the Olympics as representing their country. So they can compete for two different entities in that regard. So it's more often seen, that example is more often seen in cycling anyhow. Now, what are the sort of influences that corporations have? Well, the first thing is generally it comes down to sponsorship and displaying the logos, and the common trait is that their kit and their equipment is plastered with the logos and the sponsors' icons. They corporations can and do pay vast amounts of money for their naming rights for stadiums, and you can think of plenty of stadiums that are named after their corporations. So the Emirates, the Etihad, football stadiums that are named after the corporations, and their corporations have paid a lot of money for that privilege. And then the other thing as well, these corporations and sponsors, they pay way more money well, not always, but they do pay a lot more money than the actual performers earn in the sport. So a sponsor who is a corporation can hold more weight over the performer than the actual sport. So the money they're making from the sport is nowhere near the same they're making for the corporations and representing the corporation in a sponsorship scenario. Then you've got this other concept of TV corporations, and you can start breaking down like the influence of media and those style corporations. So ESPN, Fox News, Fox Sports, Sky Sports, BBC. They're all big TV corporations, and they dictate the timing of events. The Olympics will schedule their main headline events based on what time the TV deem it the prime viewing will be. So the 100 meters sprint finals is going to be put on in prime time viewing in the biggest viewing audience, not in the local time of the country it's being held in. Corporations and TV also dictate commercial breaks, and you look at NFL where there's lots of breaks in play and lots of TV and commercial advertising opportunities. So that's their two big influences from the media corporations. And then finally, you've got elements that are linked to the money side of it. Again, sponsors demand can put influence on their performers, that they have to compete in certain competitions. When Usain Bolt retired, he still had to then fulfill his contract with his sponsors and compete in a Diamond League athletics competition. Even though he bowed out after the Olympics, he still had to do one more race, competing in races that he'd already agreed to with his sponsors. And then we get accountability to the sponsors rather than the team. So when you're paid so much money by the contract and the sponsors, then you have to honour them as well as the team, and that generally happens probably more in international sport, and there can be an influence in that you need to play through injury and stuff like that because you have a certain deal with a corporation, and that might push yourself harder than if you were injured and just representing your team. So this is main influence of corporations. It's generally your introduction if you were going to have a 15 marker on this. Okay, so if we break down to the advantages of representing a corporation rather than a geographical based team, we could start with, okay, the corporations have an opportunity to recruit the top performers, and they don't have to worry about nationalities or location of players or competitors. So there is a larger gene pool available to them, larger range of people that they could access. This also means that the teams tend to be come from multiple nationalities, and therefore you do overcome traditional barriers and divisions between country to country rivalries. So these sort of are linked into sort of themes. I've tried to break it down into themes. So if you start on one, you could then bring into the other and pull into the other. So the next sort of theme is the impact on performers that can switch from teams. So the impact on the team. So performers can just switch from team to team. So in Formula One, they can move from one racing company to another corporation, and this can drive up the standards for the sport. The teams recruit the higher level players, and it's linked to the idea of the larger gene pool, and the standards will always go up because you're getting the best rather than what's locally available to you. Now, if we're looking at more the sponsorship side of it, sponsors don't really have national ties, so the sponsors can come from anywhere in the world, which is good for the corporations. Whereas in some geographical based teams, there's sometimes links to national sponsors and stuff like that. But the benefit of that is there's way more financial support from that corporation and business side of it, which means that performers can earn a lot more money. There's a lot more winning money available in the winnings, and that money can be reinvested, and that goes back into driving up the standards of that sport. And then if we look at the impact it has on the supporters, so the supporters are able to follow individuals rather than their teams, and going back to Formula One, or it could be cycling, and you might be a fan of a particular cyclist, and that cyclist moves from one team to the other team. You just follow that cyclist, and your ties are with the cyclist rather than the team. Whereas in sort of things like sports like football, you follow your team, and then if a player leaves, you don't worry about that player, you focus on your team. So that's where geographical versus the corporations kicks in. Supporters can have access to elite level sports, even if it's not in their locality, because if they're following these corporations that are worldwide sports, they're always going to be watching this elite level sport. They don't have to worry about it being the only thing in their location. And also, similar to the overcoming the traditional barriers between countries, you lose that side, that nationalism side from fans. In Formula One, you don't necessarily support, if you're from England, don't necessarily have to support the English teams, or you can support your favourite corporation or the racing. It's up to you. You don't have to. There's no ties as a fan to support your local team when you're looking at the impact of corporations. So all these advantages, and this would be the next point. If it was a 15 marker, the 5 marks, you would go in for the middle part of your essay. Then you'd sort of counter it with the disadvantages. There's quite a lot more disadvantages than advantages coming from the exam board. So let's have a look at them. So the first is the affinity, and I'll try to break this down into themes as well, but they do a lot of crossovers, and one will lead into the other. So when you are part of a corporation, if you're a performer or a competitor, you don't have an affinity with a particular city that you're living in and competing in, because one, your corporation isn't from a particular city, or might be, but your competitions and your fan base isn't from a particular city, and you move from city to city or work country to country, and your fans may be all over the country, maybe all over the world, so there isn't a particular affinity. So that sometimes is a negative, where you're not tied to a particular town or city. You tend to have more loyalty to the competitors have more loyalty to the brand and the corporation than they do to the team and the sport, so in the city. So we've got about this affinity and these words like loyalty, affinity, and then linked to that, the supporters don't have an affinity for a particular home city. So if you're a Crystal Palace fan, for example, you're supporting your local team in South London, and that's where your affinity comes from, your home city. Whereas supporters for corporations, it doesn't matter which city it's from, they're focused on the team and the corporation. And that sometimes, if it becomes to a national level, there's lack of passion. The fans aren't really fussed in terms of if their own national team is winning. Particularly in Formula One and things like that, it's focused on their chosen racing team, not their nationality. So that's sometimes a lack of passion from the fans there. And this is all linked to the fact that the competitions are spread all over the world. The races in Formula One go from country to country, city to city, and they're not just based in one country. So this can restrict the fans, because travel costs can accumulate. So it can be expensive for the fans if they wanted to go to lots of races, and it can limit their opportunity to watch live sport. And obviously then there's less events annually for them to watch. So this is all linked to the fact that it's this competition is spread over the world, and then you get the link to that is these venues lack regular performances. So the Formula One is held in one it's the same stadium every year, but then that's only used sporadically, and then there can be less emotional attachment to a venue, whereas sports like football and there's a big emotional attachment to particular stadiums because they're played in regularly. Now the corporation, so this is sort of more of the theme about the actual corporation, the negatives of the corporation. Well, they can be quite a faceless thing, so there isn't like an affinity with the fans, whereas a geographically based team, has a very much family atmosphere, and they're very much rooted in their fan bases, and they respond to their fans and interact with their fans quite heavily, whereas corporations tend to be faceless. Again, with most sports, the richer dominate, and this goes with any sport really, but the bigger corporations will dominate. And then some corporations have a negative image that might then influence or impact on the image of the performer. So let's just take a corporation like Red Bull, which is a well-known sports corporation, but inevitably it's an unhealthy drink, and that unhealthy drink can maybe have a negative connotations that can impact the performers. Success of the performers sometimes isn't about the individual performers and the teams. It sometimes is more about the corporations, and then the advertising and the media side of it. The corporations can steal that success and take it away from the team, away from the performers, and put it back onto themselves. So there's always some negatives that side of it. And then the corporations can be quite dictatorial, because they're putting all the money in, they're putting all the funding in, they can dictate what the team does, and then they can withdraw the funding as part of it. And you can see it creeping into sports like football as well, where big owners are sort of trying to take away the sports, or controlling the what's happening on the pitch, whereas they're just the investors, they're not the experts. And then if we break it into performers, the impact on performers, there isn't a national identity that binds the performers as a team. So even though we said it can overcome barriers and influences that way, there isn't that shared experience that they have as from the same country and the same nationality. So they don't have that identity to bind them. And then sometimes performers are not necessarily tied to corporations. And that can be seen with when they win medals, they'll go up on the podium and then they'll hold out their national flags. Quite often in Formula One, you'll see it. They'll pick up their national flags on the podium. So it's not always. It sort of varies with where they see their loyalties are, the corporation or the nationalities. So it changes a lot, and that can be seen as a disadvantage to corporations being influencing in sport. So if you are getting this question, it's probably going to be worded up around about what's the impact of corporations compared to playing for a geographical based team. And what they mean by that geographical based team is you're playing for your local club in your town that's locally, and it doesn't have to be your local club, but it's a club associated with an area, because they don't move. Whereas the competitions happen in that vicinity, in that area. Home games do, and then away is reasonably close in relative terms, whereas the corporations will be multinational teams that move across the world and compete all over the world, but then the performers could then come out to compete in their national teams as well. So that area doesn't get asked quite often. It's due to come up soon in the 2025 paper, so hopefully I've broken it down nice and easy for you, and best of luck in the exam.